Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Highside, Lowside. My name is Zach. That is Spurgeon Dunbar. Spurgeon, say hello to the ladies and gentlemen.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Zach, what do we have on the docket for the audience in this episode?
Well, as usual, we're going to give away a t-shirt. We're going to talk about some motorcycling news. The main topic of today's podcast will be our motorcycling heroes, people that influenced us and maybe people who didn't, who we wish we did. I don't know. We'll find out where the conversation goes. Our guest is our lovely colleague, Jen Dunstan, who always comes very prepared for these conversations. So we're looking forward to jumping into it.
Probably more prepared than we are.
In
the pre-production
certainly.
for the show, she had a lot of great questions and points, and Zach and I were like, we should bring that up. So with that being said, I want to dive right in, but before we do so, let's get in our word to our sponsor, Motul.
That's correct. You may remember, if you've listened to any Highside, Lowside, that Motul is a sponsor. And this is where we tip our cap to Motul and thank its support of the Highside, Lowside podcast. So if and when you're shopping for lubricants, cleaners, yeah, anything like that, if you support Motul, you in some way support Highside, Lowside.
Did you get your box of Highside, Lowside goodies yet?
I did, actually. And I was just looking at, I have my helmet clean right here. This is my little kind of garage side room where I have my helmets and my jackets and stuff. So I have my helmet clean here, ready to rock and roll, thanks to Spurgeon Dunbar and to Motul, obviously.
Yeah, Spurgeon Dunbar just sent it to you, but Motul really footed the bill on that one.
Right. Motul sent it to Spurgeon 9 months ago, and then I got it a few weeks ago. Anyway, yes, I am prepared to clean my helmet. And I have some boots that are ravaged, leather boots, and I have a little leather food here. Perfect leather. Well, I haven't tried it yet.
I really do hope that Colonel Sanders is listening. For those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, you should go back and listen to some of the previous episodes. But hopefully Colonel Sanders is listening to this and he can see that you received your Motul goodies, and then he can release the thing that he promised that he would release. And again, if you go back to the previous episodes, you'll know what we're talking about. Anywho, let's move right along to giving away a t-shirt, and the winner today. And he's a winner because he wrote into Apple Podcasts and he left us a review, which is what we encourage all of you to do. The reviews on Apple Podcasts really do help us with the ratings for the show and with the show in general. Eric Danger 13. Zach, you want to take this one?
Yes, indeed. Eric Danger 13. This is a heartwarming story. Are you ready for your heart to be warmed? I certainly hope so.
I am.
All right. Eric Danger 13 writes, for the better part of my life, my dad and I didn't have any sort of relationship. I love motorcycles like he does, but in my 20s, I moved across the country and didn't have space for money or a motorcycle. July of 2020 rolls around. I find myself living about 20 minutes from my parents' house with a garage and a very supportive fiance. Tip of the cap to the supportive partner. I bought a TW200, took the basic rider's course, and got my license. My dad and I have talked about a lot of the topics from your show. He doesn't listen yet, but I'm working on that part. Great show, guys. Thanks for keeping me entertained and giving my dad and I another topic to talk about. Holy smokes, my heart is so warm.
Yeah, so I will say that, and I don't think, for those of you listening, I didn't share this part of it with Zach, but Zach and our producer Chase actually picked out the winner for this week. And when I read the comment, it actually reminded me a lot of my relationship with my dad. We had a bit of a falling out when I was in college, and we actually spent some time not speaking. And I came home with a Triumph Bonneville, and that's kind of what brought my dad and I back together as far as our relationship was concerned. So when I was reading through Eric's comment, I really it kind of hit a little chord with me as well. So
absolutely, all the feels today on Highside, Lowside, everybody. And to be very clear, I'm making jokes about my heart being warm, but this is a genuinely cool story that Highside, Lowside would have anything to do with furthering a connection in a family. And obviously, mostly we have motorcycles to thank for that. But if we can take any credit at all, we will take credit for sending you a t-shirt, Eric Danger 13. So please do send your preferred size and mailing address to highside lowside at RevZilla.com, and I don't know, send your dad size too, maybe.
I would say I'll go one further. If you can get your dad to listen to Highside, Lowside, Eric, we'll send your dad a T-shirt as well, and you guys can wear it together. So again, thank you to Eric for writing in, and for those of you that have not already done so, please go ahead and leave us a review over on Apple Podcasts. We enjoy reading them.
Indeed. Next up, we have the news, and the first topic is sort of a sobering thing to bring up on Highside, Lowside. We don't get political here, and we don't plan to in this podcast, but we feel it was not prudent to avoid talking about the what's going on in Russia and Ukraine right now. Mostly, we would like to sort of remind everyone that it has effects across the whole of the economy, which does include motorcycles. And there have been some interesting announcements with regards to import and export, business bans and that kind of thing.
And I would like, normally we don't give out the dates in which we record these, but we are recording this one right around the beginning to middle of March. So when this releases, I think sometimes when Zach and I report on the news, we try to really kind of get into some thoughts and some opinions. So it's not just very factual based, but really with this particular story, again, depending on how much is changing on a daily basis right now in Ukraine, maybe some of this will be out of date, hopefully for the better, but maybe not. But really what we want to talk about is the fact that brands like Harley-Davidson, Polaris with Indian motorcycles, Honda, these are just some of the names that are, stopping the importation of motorcycles into Russia right now as, part of the effort to basically, side with Ukraine, if you will, and kind of, the war crimes that are, potentially happening over there. The other part of this too is what happens to Ural motorcycles. There was an article on Common Tread about, Ural motorcycles possibly being affected to the point of going out of business because of this. So there's definitely some implications in the motorcycle world.
Certainly. You have to assume a company like Ural, if you're not familiar with Ural, Ural motorcycles named after the Ural Mountains, I believe, in Russia. And Ural makes these vintage sidecar rigs, basically, and they're delightful. Frankly, they're agricultural and not super advanced, but they're fun to ride, and they are very fun. And I don't know. It's not a huge market. Motorcycling in general is not a huge market when it comes to the scale of the global economy. And certainly, basically new old stock World War II sidecars can't be a huge market. So it would be a shame if there was a major detrimental effect on that company, I feel, because I think it's a fun little niche of motorcycling.
And there's not anybody else out there doing something like that, right? Yeah, like Ural motorcycles are specifically, as they exist in America, you buy them, they're sidecars. They're factory produced sidecar motorcycles. And there's really no one else out there doing it. They're unique. The dealership that I just bought my KTM 890 from is a Ural dealer. And they had just gotten a new shipment in of Urals when I was up there picking up my bike, Kissel Power Sports, for those of you in the central Pennsylvania area. And, you wonder, this is one of 3 brands that Kissel carries, or one of 4 brands. So it's definitely, going to have an effect, locally in the U.S. for people that are, relying on selling the motorcycles, but also just in the fact that if something were to happen where Ural goes away, there's no one else out there really doing what Ural's doing. And, it's always disappointing. There's also other examples here of, F1, motocross GP pulling out of Russia, F1 pulling out of Russia. A lot of different aspects that are affecting here.
Lots of sports stuff, like a Champions League soccer game that's been pulled out of Russia. So there's obviously like lots of greater effects. And there was I think an MXGP rider was thrown out of an MXGP round in Europe because the FIM is banning or in some way sanctioning Russian athletes. Anyway, all of this, it's really important to note that the unfortunate implications or potential impacts on the motorcycling industry pale in comparison to the humanitarian destruction and all the all of what's going on is so much worse than motorcycling. But this is a motorcycling podcast, and we just wanted to ask our viewers, our listeners, to consider some of those things and follow along with it, because it is interesting and it does potentially have detrimental effects to the companies that produce the vehicles that we love to ride.
Yeah, and I think that when you look at the brands that are pulling out of a market like Russia, I think it's almost. I stand behind their decisions, and I think especially you were mentioning earlier that motorcycling isn't something that is huge and popular in the way that automotive sales are.
Right.
But that almost speaks more to the value of all of their customers, and to voluntarily take a financial hit by pulling out of a large market, means that they're really trying to do the right thing. So when you read about these brands that are trying to do the right thing from a humanitarian standpoint, it's hard not to feel good about that, and that the people in our sport are taking this seriously. So I think if nothing else, it's a kudos to the brands that are doing this.
True enough. Well, moving along in the news, slightly more uplifting story, but still has to do with the global economy. We wanted to note a story that we saw about Triumph moving some production back from Thailand to Hinckley in England, which is sort of interesting because as you pointed out, Spurgeon, sometimes people have questions about, as soon as brands start making any bikes in Thailand or anywhere other than the country of origin of the company, people immediately, it kind of casts a shadow a little bit, and people say, well, where was that bike even made? Like, if I'm buying a Triumph, am I even getting one that was made in England? And arguably that's not the point, but it is interesting to see a company pull back some of that.
And I'll just say that I've owned British-made Triumphs, and I've owned Thailand-made Triumphs. I believe mine were the ones made in Thailand. I could be wrong on that, but let's just assume that they would have been, because it was Thailand and Great Britain. But my point is that like they're all the Triumph quality is second to none. So I've been very impressed with Triumph quality. It's something we've talked about before. Triumph's producing around 20,000 motorcycles a year. Is that the correct number, Zach, that I read? I believe somewhere around there, or maybe they're shifting the production of 20,000 motorcycles back.
Yeah,
something
I think
like
that it was a shift. I think that Triumph makes more bikes than that. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but I think to your point, it was in the tens of thousands of bikes that was being shifted back to a UK factory.
Okay. But either way, I think it's, for me, the interesting part of this story was, what does this mean for other companies, right? Like, we know right now that one of the bigger issues that we're having in the motorcycle industry, as well as just in retail right now in general, is supply chain issues. So what do we think this is going to have an implication on from a supply chain standpoint, and what other manufacturers are going to follow suit? Even for us here, in the wider RevZilla, family, looking at being able to get Alpine Stars or Dainese or Revit or all these goods that are coming from outside countries, we have trouble getting them into the country right now because of all the backup in the ports outside of Los Angeles where you're filming this at, Zach. It's something that I do think has a wider implication for what that means for motorcycling in general.
Yeah, certainly. It's an interesting move, and you have to think that all the shipping and all that stuff has been a factor. I did look up that number, by the way. I believe Triumph sold more than 80,000 motorcycles in 2021, I believe, or 2020.
Okay.
It's a fraction of the actual production, but a significant fraction still. So.
Okay, yeah. So so basically, what this is saying is that Triumph is gearing up to build more than 20,000 bikes in UK for a year, and up until this point, Triumph had been moving all of their production to Thailand. They were scaling down their UK production, from what I remember.
For especially certain models, I think, like Bonneville's and stuff. I think the Rockets are still made in England, and
like the special one-offs. Like, it was all like the special one-off editions were made in Hinckley still.
Anywho, an interesting thing to keep in mind, and something to watch in the motorcycle economy. We'll see if other brands follow suit.
Yeah, the final note here, moving on to the last little piece of the news, and this is really just an update. In episode 5, of season 5. We are in season 5, right? Yeah, this is season 5. Yeah. just gonna remember exactly what we're doing here. But in the episode where we had Brandon Wise on and we were talking about dirt bike racing, we also mentioned a topic of the news there about Stark Varg. And for those of you that aren't familiar, Stark is a company that's building the Varg, and it's an electric dirt bike. And Zach and I were feeling a bit skeptical as to how quickly this was going to be able to be produced. However, at the time of filming this episode, we have been invited to Barcelona to actually ride a production version, supposedly.
Yeah. So in some way, I mean, I'm sure that this doesn't have anything to do with Highside, Lowside, but in some ways they're calling our bluff. They're putting people in seats and they're trying to get this press all spooled up about it. I still think a healthy amount of skepticism is okay, based on the delivery numbers that we cited last time. But it's pretty darn cool that someone's going to go ride one of these things, and we'll actually see what it's like.
Zach Quartz is a very glass half empty kind of fellow. I, on the other hand, I'm looking at this glass right here, and I'm thinking this is full, baby. This is a full overflowing glass. So I'm gonna say that I'm probably a little more optimistic than Zach is. I'm gonna give him a pretty positive note of intent at this point. But what I will tell you is that middle of June there will be an article on Highside, Lowside, or we're Highside, Lowside. There will be an article on RevZilla's Common Tread, and there will be a full ride report on the new Stark Varg, barring any other issues in Europe that prevent us from going to Barcelona.
So you heard it here first. Spurgeon Dunbar says that the Stark Varg is the best dirt bike he has ever ridden in his life, even though he hasn't ridden it yet.
What are you doing? My gosh, now you're taking the glass and you're just throwing it out the window. Lord.
All right, that's probably enough of us pretending to talk about news.
You're a regular Tom Brokaw over there, Mr. Quartz. Regular Tom Brokaw.
So let's jump into the actual discussion, where we will need an actual guest host, and that means we need the actual Jen Dunstan.
Will the real Jen Dunstan please join us? Well, Jen, welcome once again to the program. I do have a question. For those of you that don't follow Jen on Instagram, Jen likes to sit down and watch Highside, Lowside on her Saturday mornings, put it on the big screen, and she posts all about it on Instagram. So when you're doing that with an episode that you're in, does it change the way that you view the programming? Do you get more excited about watching an episode that you're in? Less excited? Like, how does that work for you?
Good question.
There's some apprehension there. I don't know that I want to hear the playback on my voice or some of the dumb things I probably said. So I definitely watch the episodes I'm not in a lot more than the ones that I am in. Sometimes I will just skip it completely.
Right. Well, you lived it, so that's understandable. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, Zach skips them all, so you got a better track record than he does.
It's true. I have never watched or listened to a Highside, Lowside episode. That's not actually true. Occasionally, if I say something really questionable and the editor says you might want to look at this, then I review it. Okay, so have we all come ready to talk about our motorcycling heroes and I don't know, create icons in people's minds of the people that influence us? I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a deep list. If you want me to narrow it down to one, I'm just gonna leave right now.
No, I know. I think even as we were thinking about this, we knew that this was going to be a bit of a meatier topic. For the audience, just so you're aware, again, we're going to hit on some people that are probably a little more personal, that influenced us, in our early years. We'll hit on some people that are maybe a little bit more well-known. And then maybe we'll hit on some folks that, while they are well-known in the community, they're not well-known to you in the audience, and it gives you someone that you can do a little bit of research on and learn a little bit more about as well. But we're going to try and provide some of that context for you here as we get started. And the first topic is going to be the most influential individual within our own circle. So the people that really influenced us and were kind of heroes to us as we were getting started in motorcycling. And as always, we want to do guest honors, Jen. So why don't you kick things off for us?
Well, cool. It's not just one person. I already warned you all ahead of time that this is going to happen. I think we've talked about my mom and dad in multiple episodes now already, so we know how influential they've been on my riding career.
Well, they were both motorcyclists, right? Just to be clear, so people remember. If people didn't remember, they both rode and were
Absolutely. They're both riders. I was kind of born into a household of just bike paraphernalia everywhere. They were my inspiration to get my license. So that's a big important step, of course. But other people have really influenced my riding since then. There's a fellow named Marcus Poisson, and he races vintage sidecars with the USCRA at Loudon, and he was instrumental in getting me to ride the track. And then, of course, there's my husband, Alex, who has exposed me to the wide world of motorcycling way beyond just street bikes. So I got hats off to him for making me try and do things that I never thought I would do on a motorcycle, for sure.
So when you met Alex, did you meet Alex through motorcycling, or did you meet Alex and then how did the motorcycle relationship come together with you and your husband?
Yeah, we met at the racetrack. So I was actually there being a flag marshal to earn some free track time because money was tight back then. And he was a control rider at the track day I was at. So he's riding around in the vest and showing people around and showing off in my corner because I guess he had a little thing for me already. So he's going as fast and dragging me in the rain and doing like all sorts of crazy stuff. I'm like, why is this guy's going to crash if he's not careful?
It's called peacocking. He was peacocking.
Total peacock mode. I was really concerned for him, but everything went fine. That day, and then he actually helped transport my bike home, and that was the start of our relationship. So yeah, totally been immersed in motorcycles since day one.
Why did your motorcycle need to be transported home?
Well, we were, Loudon's pretty far from South Shore, so I was even, past driving to Boston, and it was a torrential downpour kind of spring weekend. So I rode on my SV. It was nice and sunny the day before, and then when we were all packing up to leave, it was lightning and thunder and crazy, and I was like, this is gonna be a really terrible ride. And he's like, I got room in my truck, let's load it up. He's like, I want you to be safe, it's dark, it's raining. And yeah, and then now we're married, so
come with me, pretty lady.
Yeah.
So did where did he live at that point? Did he live in Boston?
Yeah, he was in Boston proper at that time. So he drove out of his way.
Right, he had to go all the way to South Shore.
Too.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Funny.
I was going to say,
ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, I was going to say what a gentleman, and Zach took it in a completely different direction. So yeah.
Well, hey, yeah, well, that's definitely a I mean, you've been surrounded by positive motorcycle influence, and it sort of has defined your life in some ways, right, Jen? I mean, you grew up with good motorcycling influences, and now you're married to a good motorcycling influence. It's kind of that's impressive.
Yeah, I'm super fortunate, and people ask all the time, how'd you get into this career? Or what got you into motorcycling? And I credit motorcycling to so many amazing things in my life. It gave me my soulmate. I have a good family bond because of motorcycling. I have lifelong friends through motorcycling.
Right.
And it's given me confidence and ambition I don't think I had before until I started riding.
Right.
With this obsession that I have. So
yeah,
I have a lot to thank motorcycling for in my life.
And Jen, you talked about this in a previous episode of the podcast, but your parents actually encouraged you to get your motorcycle license. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, so I was 16 and I asked to get it. I think they were surprised. I think they didn't think I had a curiosity for it or whatever, but I really did want to. And then when I expressed that curiosity, they're like, okay, we're going to do this the right way. And so there wasn't any fighting it, or you definitely can't ride, or we absolutely say no. They're like, okay, sounds like she's probably going to do this. Let's set her up for success, instead of telling her no and she figures it out later, probably with a lot of hard lessons learned.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. Well, I the right thing to do is to push the question to Spurgeon and not focus on myself. But I do have a kind of a tangent with my own motorcycling influences, and I want to ask a question of you, Jen. So my mom also has currently, I think, her motorcycle license. I don't think she really rides anymore, but she did occasionally when I was a kid, and my parents spent a lot of time on motorcycles together. And I don't think she rode in quite the same capacity that your mom did, but I feel like that influenced me maybe more than I realized it, as sort of understanding. I guess it was I never really saw it as it's kind of like a gender denominated thing, even though motorcycling is a, historically, male thing to do. I always just kind of understood that, well, if a woman wants to do that, then she can just do that. Was that something that you felt was really, I don't know, presented to you, or do you think you just sort of grew up understanding that without knowing it?
Yeah, I think just growing up around it, I knew that, but also I knew it was a big deal. Like technically, my mom was learning how to ride and got her license before my dad. It's because she worked for Harley, and
Right.
they really liked all their employees to learn how to ride. And while she's doing it, my dad's like, "Well, I'm not getting left behind." And like they kind of learn together.
Right.
And then both my sisters have their motorcycle licenses. They don't ride to the extent that I do, but like. I think she definitely influenced them. They didn't want to get left out at that point. They're like, all right, it looks like this is a family thing. Like I'm not getting left
Right.
behind either. So all of them have their licenses. So yeah, you're right. It will influence,
Yeah.
people in the family when one person dives in and the next person, and it doesn't have to be gender or anything.
Right.
Well, I
Yeah.
think
Yeah,
I think the parental ties is probably going to be a theme. So Zach, I guess maybe I'll ask you the question then. So, it sounds like both of your parents were probably on your list here. I know a little bit more about
Certainly.
your dad's motorcycling history because I know that the two of you raced together and there were a lot of
Right.
stories that you've shared with us. But
Right.
why don't you walk us through how your parents influenced you, and then what other influences might have hit you at a younger age?
Right. Well, yeah, my sort of my dad's influence is pretty obvious, really, that it's been a bond that we've had sort of my whole life. But yeah, like I said, my mom and dad rode motorcycles in Morocco. They were in the Peace Corps, working on a clean water project for a couple years before I was born. And they rode motorcycles to get around. And my mom actually I think she got her license in Morocco, and this is 1981 or something like that. And she rode a motorcycle around. And then when she came back to the United States, they'd been gone for a couple of years. And when she renewed her license in the United States, she just said like, "Oh, I have a motorcycle endorsement. See?" And they were like, okay. So she actually got her motorcycle license without ever having taken the test or done any of the things in the United States, which is kind of like a funny slash.
That's boss status right there.
Yeah, exactly.
She just skipped the line.
Exactly. Yeah. She's like, no, I rode a motorcycle in Africa. I can ride one here. And they were like, okay, whatever. Anyway. Yeah. And I mean, most of my mom's time was spent, like on the back of a bike with my dad, and they honeymooned that way and they traveled that way. And, so yeah, I guess sort of a little bit more of a traditional relationship in that sense, hers with motorcycling. But I think the fact that she, experienced it herself and did spend time doing it helped her outlook of my life also. I think that's a huge piece of it, is that I think it's a very motherly thing to say like, oh, I don't want my child to do anything dangerous. I just want to protect them. But she was always very kind of realistic about, about the danger and about kind of understanding that it's a piece of my life that was important to me, and that's also worth something, even though there's risk involved. I appreciate that aspect of it, and I think that influenced me in ways that I never really appreciated until I met people that were like, oh man, my parents wouldn't let me have a bike, so I had to like move out when I was 17 or 18 so that I could get a bike, and obviously that's common, and I understand that now. But I think when I was a little kid, that was never even on the table. Like it was always just sort of obvious. Like, yeah, you can ride a motorcycle if you want to, no big deal. Which is just I don't know if there's a greater influence.
Well, I would say out of the
someone.
three of us, you probably were the youngest, right? Like, how old were you when you first rode?
6 or 8, I think. Yeah,
That's younger than me.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, and I mean, your parents were kind of like, they were a little bit strict about it, right, Jen? They were sort of like, oh, you can do it, but you have to wait and you have to get your license, and like, no, you can't ride my bike. You have to get your own bike, like that kind of thing. Is that right?
Well, they made her fix up. Her mom basically tricked her into fixing up her motorcycle, and then wouldn't let her ride it.
Angry text message from mom in 3, 2, 1.
I keep forgetting that your parents actually watch these episodes.
Oh,
so
yeah.
like we get Jen in trouble.
One.
We get Jen in trouble regularly.
But you're right. Yeah, I got my permit at 15. I got the license at 16. Right. Went through all those courses, but there's no childhood riding for me at all because there's no opportunity for it, and that's not how my parents started either. They didn't start young either, and I think they're just street riders forever and still are to this day. Like my dad rode a dirt bike for the first time out here on my property nice. 2 years ago, and that was game changing for him. But yeah, I definitely went that traditional street route. So no childhood riding.
Yeah, I think I grew up on 35 acres of land with no siblings, so they were probably like good gracious, let's give him something that he can do because we need to throw him a bone. But Spurge, we've gone long enough without hearing your
no.
answer, so
I think, like, again, I think that the themes here are really interesting. And, I had probably more of a similar background from my home life, kind of compared to both of you. I mean, I'm similar to both of you in different regards. I grew up on about 40 acres in the middle of nowhere, much like you, Zach, but I wasn't allowed to have a motorcycle. We had go-karts because they were deemed safer. I don't think my parents know how many times I almost like broke a neck because these are like old 70s go-karts that didn't have roll cages, and like
oh,
when
they
would
did not
catch,
have roll cages.
Oh, no. So like God. You would catch and they'd flip and you'd have to like put your hand down so they wouldn't, snap your neck.
Oh,
but
gosh.
But I grew up with, again, the biggest influences were my parents because my mom and my dad rode together. My mom did not have a motorcycle license, but like all the pictures growing up were, the first time that my parents met, they were working at a nursing home. My dad was working maintenance and my mom came in looking for a summer job from college. And my dad went to like his boss and was like, you should hire her. And so he did. He got her hired and then like offered to give her a ride home. And the funny story was my dad was like, well, if I give you a ride home on a motorcycle, are your parents going to be upset? And my mom said, no, I'm 18 years old. I can do whatever I want to do. You can give me a ride home on your motorcycle. And my dad shows up and drops my mom off. And the next day, my mom came into work and was like, I can't ride on your motorcycle anymore. I'm not allowed to. So she tried to like be a big, strong, independent woman. And I guess my grandparents kind of shut that down. But they went on to...
So what about... Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, what about the famous Uncle Bob?
Yeah, so
Uncle Bob, presumably.
He came a little bit more of a stronger influence. So Uncle Bob is my mom's youngest sister, or my mom's youngest brother. So when my dad and my mom started dating, my dad kind of brought the motorcycle influence into my mom's family. And Uncle Bob at the time was relatively young. I mean, like high school, middle school young, because there was I think like a 10-year difference in age between my mom and Uncle Bob.
Gotcha.
So when Uncle Bob came into the picture, I was born in 83. Uncle Bob was 19 when I was born. So as I grew up and my parents became more responsible, my dad sold his motorcycle when I think I was 4 years old. There's a little cute picture of me sitting on his Yamaha XS 750. But Uncle Bob became the person that actually influenced because when my dad
Uncle
sold
Bob
his bike,
became less responsible.
Uncle Bob was becoming less responsible, right? So my parents are trying to grow up and become adults and kind of give up the motorcycling thing. And Uncle Bob is showing up with KLR 650s, putting me on the back and taking me for a ride while my mom is like screaming and freaking out. So my parents were definitely influential in the fact that there were always motorcycles around in conversation, even after my dad sold the bike. And we'll see this as we get on in the conversation. Most of my biggest influences outside of my direct connection were really authors because I grew up with like my dad didn't have motorcycles in the garage anymore, but there were books and there were magazines and there was all this literature. He would take me out on Saturday mornings and we'd go to motorcycle shops and just look at bikes. But I've talked a lot about my dad and Uncle Bob. The one influence that I do want to hit on, because this really hit me in more of my high school years, was I went to high school, and again, I lived out in the middle of nowhere, so very rarely could I just go over to a friend's house. But the one friend that lived close enough that I could ride a bike to was a friend by the name of Matt Curry. And Matt Curry... in my mind, became one of the coolest kids in high school because he rode a motorcycle to high school. His dad let him get a motorcycle when he was 16. His older brother rode a motorcycle, Nick, and I'm still friends. Nick and I still see each other, from time to time. I haven't seen Matt in a couple of years, but Matt and Nick Curry were these two kids, the only kids that I knew in high school that would ride their motorcycles in. And there was one teacher that would let them lock the motorcycle helmets in the classroom. And I thought that was the coolest thing. And I later went on to ride with Matt, and Matt and I became really close. And he was a big influence as I started my own motorcycle career in college. So he was someone that I think was more on my age level that played a huge influence in my life. So shout out to Matt and Nick Curry.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. Do you... Jen, do you have anybody in your life that was not a family member that sort of, aside from your husband, which sort of came later. But like, was there anyone outside your family that was sort of into bikes that pulled you along or gave you advice because oftentimes it's different, right? The advice or the sort of like encouragement or discouragement that you get from someone who's not a family member.
Honestly, sometimes you hear it better when it comes from someone who's not in your family.
Right.
So Marcus Poisson was the one who, not only did he was a mentor in the workspace. I just got out of college. I was an industrial designer, and he was he joined the same company as I did at the same time, and he was much older, and had a lot more experience. So not only was he a mentor in the workplace, but he was also a very avid rider, and again, like a longtime racer with the USCRA. And that's how I got into racing. But also, he was very good at telling me about, all the gear all the time. I think I was a little bit squiddly back then. I was a young 20-something that knew better than everyone, and I would wear, I'd ride to work in my polyester pants and sometimes in just bikinis to the beach. Like, I really didn't care. Like, I thought it was so cool to, like, ride around in this manner. And every time my parents were like, what happens when you crash? I'd be like, well, you just don't crash. Oh, I thought I had like the funniest comebacks, right? It was really Marcus who turned me around on that. And he was very patient because I had all the same quips, and he would rework the way he would approach it with me. He'd be like, oh, check out this cool new Dainese jacket. Like, all the cool girls are wearing this at the bike night. Look at it. Like, he'd show me magazines and stuff, right? And I was like, oh, okay, that's what the cool people do? Maybe I'll think about it. And I think the big aha moment was when I went and watched him race. So I went out on like a Labor Day. This must have been like 2007, 2008. My first time ever going to the racetrack. Just went to watch him and his wife race their sidecars. And, someone inevitably crashes on the track, and you're like, oh my God, like, it looks so violent and scary.
Yeah.
And then I went in the paddock, and he's like, I want you to meet, Matt or so-and-so, whoever it was that went down. He dragged me over, and he's like, look at what his suit did for him. And, Matt's fine. He's walking around. He's laughing about it. And I was like, and then Matt raced again later in the day. And I was like, oh my God, like, I do need to wear this stuff. I need all this stuff.
Right.
So I started racing, and I started wearing all the gear, and that's hats off to Marcus. And one really cool thing I want to tell you about Marcus, he's like a BMW head through and through. Yep. So much so, he has the opposed twins tattooed across his chest, an entire huge
dedication.
chest piece.
That's like Zach's dad. Yeah.
Dude, so he's all in. And so for an outside member of the family to influence my riding so much, like, Marcus is for sure the one.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, I definitely, a friend of my dad's was sort of the same way. He hung out at our house a lot when I was little and worked on his bikes in our garage. And I think it was the same kind of thing, like, he taught me lessons that I feel like he was sort of like, his communication, his relationship with me was different than, because he's not a parent, and like you said, you look up to those people in different ways, and you hear them differently than you do your own parents. My favorite lesson that he taught me was, I rode his bike like down the driveway. I was like putting around on it. It was a small street bike that he had, but I was little. I wasn't big enough to ride it, really. I was way before I had a license. And I tipped over, and I couldn't pick the bike up because it was like a 350-pound bike or whatever, and I was like 12 years old. So I went back, and I said, oh, I need help getting the bike. And I said something like, it tipped over. And he said, no. The motorcycle does what you tell it to do. And so therefore, if the motorcycle is on its side, that is something that you did to the motorcycle because, you were in control, allegedly. And that was something that's always stuck with me. And even in, basically any crash I've ever had, any tip over, any incident I've ever had, I can always think back to like, yeah, I was in control of that. I was the one that did that thing, which is not something that's
but that's a great
hear.
lesson. That's a great lesson to learn, especially early on,
Right. And it's the kind of thing that, like, maybe if my dad said it to me, it would have been like, oh, he's being glib, or, he's just trying to like pass the buck and teach me a lesson. Whereas when Tom said it, I was like, okay.
Yeah.
That's fair. Well, if it pleases the court, if it's okay with you guys, I'd like to move on to broader.
The last thing, the last thing I want to throw out before we move on, I'm gonna let you move on, but and this is kind of, Zach and I met. I think the first time we met was on a BMW launch, and we were playing a game where we were talking about, like, if we could only have 5 motorcycles in the garage. That's the kind of fun shenanigans that really happen at motorcycle launches. We get
really
a few cocktails in us, and we just play a game of what motorcycles do you want in the garage. But that was the first time that I had mentioned a Honda Superhawk to Zach, and it's been this like ongoing joke between us where he's like, out of all the motorcycles you want in the world, why would you want like a mid-90s Honda Superhawk? Well, Matt Curry was the one who when I was in college, he had a red Honda Superhawk, and I had no interest in sport bikes. I had my little Triumph Bonneville, and I was going in a completely different direction. And Matt was the one that was like, "You should just take this for a ride." And he was the first person that ever let me ride a sport bike, and it changed the entire course of where I wanted to go in motorcycling, because now all of a sudden this bike was insanely fast. And I mean, in retrospect, you look back, I think a Superhawk made maybe like 115 horsepower, but at the time I was like, this has opened up an entire new world for me.
No one has ever gone this fast.
It was just unbelievable. And so I think that I do have to say that, like, I have to give credit to Matt Curry as the individual who showed me this whole other world of motorcycling at a very influential point in my life, where like maybe I would have gone in a different direction with my affinity for two wheels if that hadn't happened. And it really kind of influenced further purchases that I made. So
fair enough. And just to be clear, the Honda Superhawk is a perfectly cool. It's a cool bike. I'm not a hater of the Superhawk.
You just question why I put it on such a pedestal. That's the
well,
difference.
You know, we all have our little vices, I suppose. So now for broader influences, bigger, you know, perhaps more famous or sort of like overall influences, ones that we weren't necessarily close to personally, but had an effect on our lives, motorcycling or otherwise. Jen Dunstan, guest honors as always. Would you like to kick it off? Do you have someone that you can point to as an influence of yours?
It's funny. I had to divide this into two lists because honestly, I was like people, figures that were really important to me, and then figures that I feel like a lot of the motorcycling world would recognize that kind of influence. So now that we've narrowed it down to personal heroes, it's still a really long list. I don't know where to begin.
Let's start at the top. No pressure. We got time.
We got time. Yeah, we're only like 25 minutes into this one. We've been going like for like 2 hours. So you entertain us.
Oh man, I mean, it's probably not going to surprise either of you, but this is a long list of racers.
Nice. I think we're gonna have some overlap here.
Yeah. Well, I could start with some like really influential female racers that I just look up to so much. Like Anna Carrasco, who is the first female to win a world title with that World Superbike 300 win that she won a couple years ago. She's the first to ever do it, and that's for the viewers who don't know, that's in a class of men. There's not any special women's classes at that level of racing, and she's the first to do it. So that is just like a historic moment.
She won on it was the Ninja 300, right? That she won on.
It was on the Kawasaki. It was the 400. There were some weird rule changes they did mid-season, but also she was still winning races after the rule changes. So, I mean, some people are like, oh, she had a more powerful motorcycle, but then they fixed that halfway through the season, and she was still really competitive. So I don't want anyone to like try and downplay that championship, because she still won it fair and square.
Also that World Supersport 300 class is sort of like Moto 3 and MotoGP. It's just like tooth and nail, like unbelievable amounts of sort of like desire and energy, and like any of those races, anyone who can pull off a win is like has their elbows out and they are tussling hard. The idea of sort of like tarnishing her win in the World Championship is ridiculous.
Well, it's a massive achievement.
I just think those bikes in general, like I know we've talked about it before, and we don't need to go too far down this road, but like riding those bikes on a racetrack is so much more fun than riding big displacement bikes, because you really have to understand all the little I mean, you can't make up for the power loss if you brake too soon, and you have to maintain throttle and carry that in the corners in a completely different way. And it's just, those bikes are so much fun, but they're also a completely different kind of challenging to ride. So yeah,
certainly.
Absolutely.
So who else, Jen? Anna Carrasco, that's a good one.
So Vicky Golden is a similar figure in my mind. She's a motocross racer, but mostly freestyle now. So she was one of the first women, her and Steffi Bayou, to qualify for a night show at Supercross. And for anyone who rides or races motocross knows what a stunning achievement that is. There's just, and again, no women's class or anything like that. They have to go head to head with the men to get on that starting gate. So that was a big deal. And what she does off of ramps and freestyle too is so inspiring. Like,
and when you say night race, you're talking about kind of like for those of us that are listening and might not know exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about more of like the premier event, right?
The main event. Yeah. Because there's daytime qualifying, and a bunch of people don't make that. They cut a ton of riders just in that. So to make the night shows is kind of, for every privateer, is a big deal. And that's what she was too. So I want to point that out too. There's no factory support or anything. She was doing that on her own. So massive achievement. And also all of the crazy freestyle backflips and tricks she does is awe-inspiring. So when it comes to female riders who I follow intensely and really inspired by, those are the two. But when it comes to the big names of racing, obviously I've been a Valentino fan forever. I'm going to stop it there because I know Zach's going to probably have a lot to say about that. And Nikki Hayden influenced me a lot as well, just to want to watch MotoGP and get into it. And I think that's the power of having like an American or someone of your nationality doing well and being talked about in a race 100%. Series. You know, I was not a race fan. I didn't really follow MotoGP, but once he was hitting his stride in 2005 and 2006, and all my friends are talking about it, it's in the magazine and it's at the bike night, and there's, you know, Repsol replica. Like everyone in America was going nuts over it, and I got caught up in that. And now look at me now, like I'm totally obsessed. So those are two big ones for sure. And I would say like finally I picked like a celebrity standout. Right? There's plenty of like famous Hollywood people who have ridden and all that. It's hard to get away from Steve McQueen, right? He is what he is. But also I want to give a shout out to Ewan McGregor because, and this might be controversial, I'm waiting for Spurge to like pounce on me. But I think he might have ignited like the adventure bike craze that we see today. Now, I'm not saying there weren't adventure bike riders before him, etc. But, you know, watching, you know, Long Way Round and Long Way Down, I think for me, it was inspiring. Like, I didn't know I had a new wanderlust, but after watching those shows, like, let's dual sport. Let's do this. Like all of a sudden I wanted to ride some dirt roads, and Alex is like, what the heck? Just what? You know? And then, and I think him and Charlie Borman had a serious effect on a lot of other riders who maybe weren't adventure riders before, but definitely were after that.
I have, the only thing I'll debate with you is that I didn't know where to put Ewan and Charlie. So for those of you that are listening and you're not aware that we've got a piece of paper in front of us that has outlined the entire program the way that we want to kind of position it. I had Ewan and Charlie under the most influential to the industry and some of the effects that they had there. But what I will touch on briefly, because I'll save that for later in the podcast, from an influence over me standpoint, I remember where I was when I first watched that. And I was living in Nashville. I watched it a couple years after it was actually released. It was released, I believe, in 2004. And I had a couple of buddies that I was teaching how to ride motorcycles. I didn't have any friends that rode, so I made friends, and then I made those friends buy motorcycles. And we would sit around at night. We all worked at a bar together, and we would get off of our shifts, and we'd go back to my place, and we'd put them on the TV, and we'd have a couple of beers and watch them. And it's really what I was able to use to influence my friends into riding and show them this big adventure of motorcycling. So, and to me, it's what shifted me into adventure bikes. I've talked about it in Common Tread articles. I've talked about it in here. When my dad came home with the V-Strom, I didn't understand adventure bikes, and I kind of I poo-pooed my dad as being out of touch because cafe racers were cool and sport bikes were cool, and this whole thing wasn't going to catch on. And I've eaten crow since, obviously, because I've become a huge adventure rider. But I think that show had a lot of personal influence on me in a very positive way. Some of my friends. But I did save it because I think it has a very positive influence on the industry as well, and we'll touch on that probably a little bit later in the podcast. But I agree with you. I agree with you, Jen. You're not going to get any pushback from me on that one.
So I guess I liked what you said about how those people influenced you, especially Nikki Hayden, and saying like, oh, it's like he's an American, so that sort of like tugs at your heartstrings a little bit, or like pulls you in to a certain extent. Have you found yourself? I don't know that this is like a reaching for a kind of a secret window in your soul, I guess. But, with Vicky Golden or someone like that, when you're on a motocross track, are you like, do you have that sort of childlike feeling of imagining yourself doing what she does? Or how do you how would you articulate your influence more specifically?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of daydreaming that happens where
Nice.
I'm as good as these people. Actually, someone else I need to give a shout out to is Melissa Paris, who is a very accomplished road racer and gone international and stuff. And I have the privilege of calling her a friend. And every time we ride together or we're together, like I instantly try and go harder. I don't know what it is. If it's like I want to impress her, or I want like some compliments from her later. Like we're at Chugwalla and I was like, I need to go faster. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do that. Like she definitely has that influence on me. I think my head's really straight about I'll never hit a jump like Vicky Colden or any people like that.
Right.
But I think for sure when I'm amongst that kind of environment and with those people, you definitely go a little bit harder.
Right.
I think I think there's influences like that. Like it must be very exciting for you to have someone that is on a more professional level that you can now call a friend. Whereas I think for me, like I don't.
Spurgeon's never met anyone famous.
No, I was just gonna say, like, I definitely have friends that are like that are influencing me. Like one of our Riders Alliance team members, Liz Canary, her and her husband Jeff, I ride with a lot, and we were out at a dual sport ride last year, and like like Liz and I were going toe to toe and like really trying to keep up with and chase and pass in ride harder. I think that's really what we're getting at here, right? Like there are people that have, influenced us in a personal way where we are better riders because those people in our lives. And in some cases it's, a famous person, but also in some cases it's just the people that we surround ourselves with in everyday life that can have that influence over us. But I think it's cool that you were able to find somebody that you knew because of their industry provenance, and then you were able to, befriend them and ride with them.
Melissa's story, and if she hears this, she's gonna be so embarrassed. I love doing this to her. Like, she was such an inspiration. Like, she was racing 250s at the time. She was making waves. I had just started racing vintage, and I'm dating my husband now at the time, and he's like,
"Are you calling him vintage?"
Yeah. Now you're really getting me in trouble, Spurge. But he's like, check out this female racer, Melissa Parrish. She's gonna go pro. She's going national. Like, she's so fast and everything. And I remember checking out. I'm like, wow, like she's my hero. And he's like, hey, we're gonna go to one of the AMA races and we're gonna get her autograph and you're gonna meet her one day. Like, I promise you that. And I was like, yeah, I can't wait. And then we actually just through circumstances and industry roles we end up meeting and becoming friends. Like, I was part of her pit crew for a season. Like, and I wrote her this sappy email, and I know it made her cry. And I was like, I never knew like my hero would someday become like one of my best friends. And so I'm so thankful for that. And anyone who's followed Melissa or see what she does with the Royal Enfield Build Train Race program, or the things she does as a mechanic on a race team now, like she's always supporting and help build people up, along with always pushing her own riding. So yeah, she's a special person, and I'm so lucky to call her a friend.
Yeah, agreed.
That's awesome.
That's a kind of an amazing connection to make. And like you said, it sounds like you can feel how it sort of pushes you to try harder or to be better in a super direct way. Which I want to make it
clear, I never ever serve it to Melissa. She's like way faster than me. But when we're on the track together, I try to give her something to compliment me on.
Right. You heard it here first, Melissa Parrish. If you're listening, Jen says she's faster than you are. So
I can't believe you said that for the entire world to hear, Jen. My Lord.
So Spurge, I think it's your turn. Talk us through some of the influences you've had in your motorcycling life. Some of your authors, nerd.
No, it's true. I mean, I knew going into this that that you and Jen probably have much more of a racing background and probably have a bit more influence in that way. I mean, I think number one, Peter Egan was a huge influence on me. For those of you that aren't aware, Peter Egan wrote for Cycle World magazine for 33 and a half years. I think the joke was when he was retired, it was 33 and a third years, which is the same speed that you play a record on an old turntable. But he wrote an article it was like 2003. And again, like I said, I grew up with all these magazines around the house, and my parents were less than keen on me getting into motorcycling, despite the fact that they were a huge influence on it. And my dad would have these Cycle World magazines laying around the house. And I went back and I looked it up, and I brought a whole stack of like actual books to use as props here. But that'll tie into some of the comments later in the episode. But there was an article that he wrote called, I think it was like Thin Ice Blues or Ice Cold Blues. And it was like in 2003.
And this is a Cycle World column?
This is a Cycle World column.
Gotcha.
And then there was later an article published. I read it in one of his books, but it was an article that I think was published in the Adventure magazine that Cycle World had done at the time. But it was a story about him going down to Tennessee and picking up a Triumph Bonneville and then like riding it through the Delta and like researching all this blues history. And the column was about like the behind the scenes of what went into that article. And it was just, it captured my attention, right? And at the time, I didn't realize that Triumph Bonnevilles were still around. I think part of my other influence was my dad would watch a TV show, and at the time he had it in like a DVD set, but it was called Then Came Bronson, and it was about this guy that got disenfranchised with making money out in San Francisco and just rode his Harley Davidson Sportster around. And anyway, I'm getting way off topic here. But with Peter Egan, he wrote this story. He talks about going to pick up this Bonneville, and he rides it around. And I was just like, this is just so cool. Like I was into road trips at the time, but I was taking road trips in my 1987 Dodge Caravan. And like the idea of having a motorcycle was much more romantic. So fun point to kind of tie that off was the dealership in which Peter Egan rode his Harley from Wisconsin down to pick up this Triumph Bonneville was a dealership called Castle Power Sports in Nashville, Tennessee. And fast forward like 15 years of my life, and when I moved to Tennessee, I ended up getting a job at the same dealership that I read about back in 2003 in this column. My first motorcycle that I bought was a Triumph Bonneville because of this column. So, Peter Egan just had a really influential. It really changed the way that I looked at motorcycling. It made motorcycling approachable to me, and it made motorcycling something that I could do for myself. And to me, that was a big influence. So for anyone that doesn't know exactly where to start, he did there's a couple of Leanings series. There's Leanings 1s, 2, 3, but the first one is still my favorite. So that's where I'd recommend starting is Leanings. I think Leanings 2 though is where that column was republished. So if you're looking for it, that's where you can find it. So
yeah.
Peter Egan was definitely one. I would say just some other ones to hit on. Ted Simon with Jupiter's Travels. For those of you that have never read this book, what I thought was really interesting about Ted Simon was Ted Simon didn't actually ride a motorcycle up until deciding to buy a motorcycle and spend 4 years driving it or riding it around the world. And I think it was 71 or somewhere around there, but he went to the Triumph factory and said, I'd like a motorcycle, and left the Triumph factory never having ridden a motorcycle with a brand new motorcycle, and proceeded to have one heck of an adventure. And I think that really kind of ties into what I liked about motorcycling. Even before I got into adventure bikes, I remember taking the Bonneville on cross-country trips and like dirt roads, wherever you wanted to go and the things you wanted to see. For me, motorcycling was all about the adventure and the places that you could go on them. And, those were two really big influential people. The final one was Clement Salvadore. He was someone that wrote for Rider magazine when I was growing up. He still might, but his book.
Is Spurgeon Senior a Rider magazine subscriber?
Oh, Spurgeon Senior was Rider magazine, Cycle World, Motorcyclist. We had all the motorcycle magazines. So for me, this was my big influence in motorcycling. And like I said, I wasn't allowed to have them growing up. But then as I bought motorcycles of my own, and I started having trips of my own, some of the stories that I read in these books became inspiration for the trips that I then took on my own. So they were some major influences on my life.
Yeah. And did you find yourself like wanting to journal as you traveled, or like because of these people? Like, did you find yourself wanting to write because of that as well?
Yeah,
or?
I mean, that's where a lot of the influence for the writing came from, right? And there was someone, I wrote an article the one time about Graham Parsons' death, and I was on a Yamaha SCR 950 launch, and I decided I wanted to do this story where after the launch was over, I took an SCR 950 out to Joshua Tree, and I kind of worked in this whole story of how Graham Parsons, they stole his body and they took it out to Joshua Tree and they set it on fire, and then the police showed up, and it's an interesting article. It's on Common Tread. And
if you do say so yourself, tell people who Graham Parsons is.
Graham Parsons, it was an influential musician in like the alt country movement of the 70s. So think like Eagles, pre-Eagles. He is probably most famously known for he co-wrote Wild Horses with Keith Richards for the Rolling Stones. So
Gotcha.
Anyway, I don't want to get too off topic there, but one of the comments on that article was, this reminds me a lot of Peter Egan. Like, way to go! Like, you kind of channeled your inner Peter Egan here, and it was a huge compliment because Peter Egan is someone that I think is an amazingly talented writer, and to ever be compared to him is something that I think forever was a shining light in my career. Doing this stuff. But I will say, I never met him. I've never met any of my heroes. So Jen's talking about getting to meet some of the heroes and the influences that have. I talked about it on one episode of Highside, Lowside. I saw Peter Egan once at MotoGP in Indy, and I almost chased him into the bathroom. And as I was opening the bathroom stall door, I was like, that's probably not a great way to meet somebody. And I stopped myself. So that was about as close as I came.
Right on. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good tour through your influences in so much as I know that they feel very different from mine. And I feel like that's an important thing to remember, that you can find these things wherever you wherever is meaningful to you. And you were like reading stories about motorcycles that then came back to you in a certain way. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think for me, it really influenced. Like I know for both you and Jed, I think the racetrack has played a lot of a role in your lives. Yep. And for me, motorcycling was more about the road trip. And I think that's where a lot of the reason that I kind of gravitated towards these authors were they painted for me a more tangible experience for motorcycling. I didn't have a racing influence that it didn't seem tangible to me. Going to a racetrack and riding like that on a racetrack didn't seem tangible, but throwing a set of bags over a motorcycle and going for a ride for a couple of days felt very tangible. And that's really where my influence in motorcycle started with and continues to this day to a large extent. So, and I'm sure there's a lot of people that are listening to the podcast that can kind of think about a time where a road trip was something that was influential in their life. But yeah,
certainly.
So anyway, let's bring this back to you, Zach. I've talked about my influences. Jen's talked about hers. What about yourself?
Well, interesting segue with the road trip thing and the racing thing. One person that I wrote down as influential in my life was a guy. I don't know if you remember seeing this guy, Jen. Maybe you did, because we sort of rolled in the same circles at USCRA, like Vintage Racing Club in New England. But there was a guy who would show up occasionally with a CB350 race bike, a Honda CB350 race bike, which is sort of the most common vintage race bike. And he towed it behind a Goldwing on a trailer to the track. And he would show up with his old 80s Goldwing, like it was a 4-cylinder Goldwing, I think. And with a little trailer on it with the CB350 and a little toolbox, and just set up his pit and ride around the track, and then he would put it back on the trailer and he'd ride home. Do you remember seeing that guy ever?
Gosh, I don't know, but he probably lapped me. I was in that race class. There's a lot faster guys and gals that were out there, but that's next level to ride and trailer to the races and then ride all day and then ride and trailer home. Yeah, that's a long day.
Yeah, that's gnarly. So yeah, and I remember my dad just being like, my dad had so much admiration for him, because we would show up with a van and a trailer and a little pop-up tent and a workbench and coolers and food and sleeping bags and just so much
decadent
stuff,
decadent, Zach.
The 15-passenger van with an air mattress in the back, very decadent. But anyway, my dad was just like, that is so flippin' cool that he does that. And obviously there are plenty of before you start writing an angry letter about how it's not a good idea, there are plenty of risks involved with that. Like going to the track on or with on your motorcycle of any kind is always a little risky as far as getting home. But I just thought that was just really cool and such a kind of, I don't know, an alternative take on how you can get to the track, and how you can, and there wasn't an amount of motorcycles that I could ride at that age that was too much. And that was sort of what struck me about it. It was like, oh, well, if you just want to involve yourself with riding motorcycles while you go to the track, you can do that too. Which is, I still think pretty cool.
I don't want to deter too much, but I think it bears mention that our very own Lance Oliver, the editor over at Common Tread, spends most of his track days, he rides his track bike to the track,
right?
Does all the prep work in the morning first thing, does the track day, then puts all the mirrors and stuff back on, and then rides home, which again, like you said, heaven forbid something goes wrong, you don't have a ride home at the end of the day on your bike.
You just have to hope that there's a handsome knight in shining armor who says, Oh,
Why don't you throw that in the back of my truck, young lady, and I'll get you home.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's free candy too.
In his windowless van. So I should circle back to what Jen said about Valentino Rossi, Nikki Hayden. Like those are certainly people that influenced me. Another name I throw out there, Ben Bostrom, who was sort of like at the peak of his power, maybe when I was a teenager, and you know they all kind of influenced me in different ways. I think. I remember thinking that, you know, Valentino was so, and I think he, you know, it's one of the reasons he's been so popular is that he's so personable. You know, you feel like you know him, you feel connected when he does an interview because he feels very open and vulnerable and sort of self-deprecating, and that I think. Not that it was a trick, but that worked on me. You know, I was sort of like, oh wow, I feel like, and he's just a little bit older than I am, so. All his, you know, he was always just like cool older kid who was living this insane dream that I, you know, always wanted to, and was more, it sort of became more real in some ways with when Nikki Hayden had success, because I feel like I watched him in person and like I got his autograph and I like talked to him and his little brothers when they would come for like the national race in New Hampshire. You probably remember that, Jen. And so you sort of felt a little closer, and then he was an American and he was on the world stage and everyone thought he was really cool. And it was sort of like, whoa, you know, like that guy, he like looks American. He sounds American. He, in a lot of ways he acts American, you know, but he's having success in this global stage, which is just like ultimately cool in my mind.
Yeah. I got a question for you, Zach, actually, because when I was going through my list, there's most influential people, right? And,
right.
You know, I was adding up everyone's stats of all these racers. And so when you look at Nicky, like, he has like an AMA championship and a MotoGP championship, but he's not like a huge title collector. He didn't even win a ton of MotoGP races, but it was his personality and everything else that gave him so much influence. And also, my question for you is, I was trying to weigh all this, and like I was even to the point I was like, there's some riders who have huge title counts, but in my book they're not as influential as some other riders, like especially when I was looking at Supercross and Motocross, and I could dive into that whenever we want. But I want the specific question for you, Zach, is I was actually adding up riders who really changed the game, whether it was a new riding style or, you know, Rossi's celebration wins or whatever.
Right.
Like how do you personally weigh that against like a big collection of titles? Like who gets more respect and influence from you, you know, on that kind of parameter?
That's a good question. And I think that, to your point, the personality has so much to do with it, you know? And I think that it's because it's sort of the star quality that someone has can be so much of what makes them memorable. And I don't like, I never was a huge fan of Nicky's riding or like, of the, I don't know, I guess I never, like his championship was, you know, it's not like he won a championship Marc Marquez style where he won or finished second in like 15 of the 18 races. Like he just literally dominated, and you're like, that is clearly the best rider in the world. Like the championship that Nicky Hayden won, if Valentino had won that year, I think everyone would have been like, yeah, that's fair. You know, like I don't think anyone would have thought like, oh, Nicky Hayden really got cheated out of that championship, you know? He was in it with a fight, and he was always sort of like a bootstrap rider. It was always like, I if I just try hard, I can do it, you know? And he's also, I don't, you know, not that I thought we would be best friends, but he's sort of the type of person similar to Valentino that you're like, if you live next door, that'd be nice. He just seems like a nice person. And he seems like the type of person you'd want to associate yourself with. You'd want your family to meet, you know, it seems like a good person. I think that star quality has a lot to do with that. And I don't know if you'd agree, but
yeah. And I would say, like, you know, I think we gravitate towards these riders because they genuinely enjoy what they're doing, and you can feel that. And as all of us kind of regular riders who, you know, oh, wouldn't be nice if I was a MotoGP racer. Oh, what a star life. And you know, we have like this fantasy built up in our head. It's hard when a rider is expressing to you that they're not enjoying it and it's just a job and they're very begrudging about it. I'm sure all of us can think of a couple racers in our head who were regular complainers and hated the media, and they just like would sour the mood for me. I'm like, if you hate racing so much, like, why are you here? And you know, the more I've read about all these different racers and things they've been through, I'm like, oh, I get it. Like it was a tough childhood.
Yeah.
Mortgage the house. Think of all the pressure they're under.
Yeah.
But yeah, when we think of our heroes, like we want them to have that positive mental attitude. We want them to be like the Nickies or like the Rossies, who are like just genuinely happy all the time to be doing that job. Like that's
Absolutely.
the aspiration.
I have a question. So, Zach, obviously you fantasized about bringing these racers home for dinner. Did you ever meet any of them? Jen was telling the story about meeting and riding with. Is there anybody that you met that was a huge influence on your life, and how did that interaction go if it did happen?
Yeah, good question. I can't think of a person that I'm trying to think of someone that I met that I really, when I was young, I thought like, oh, that really influenced me. I'll have to think on that and maybe circle back to it.
Okay.
I've not really met Valentino. I've been in like press conference rooms with him. I've interacted with him as sort of like waving or saying hello or something like that, but not really. Nikki, I've spent a little bit of time with. I did one interview in particular when I worked at Motorcyclist, where it was a private interview. He came to our office. He hung out. We spent a little bit of time together. I think that you maybe that's what in my mind sticks out as him being influential, despite, like you said, Jen, not being a multi-time multi title winner, is the sort of reality of his existence, and how he seemed just as real in person as he did on TV. And it was I think that he also just had such a to see him, to meet him, and to think, wow, this guy is pretty cool. And then to have I've talked to engineers that worked on the Ducati MotoGP team, and I think anyone for an American looking at a Ducati MotoGP team, you think like, well, those people know what cool is, right? I mean, they work on like exotic Italian racing motorcycles, and to have an Italian mechanic for a MotoGP team tell me, like, I just can't imagine a cooler person than Nicky Hayden. I just he's just such a cool guy. Like, yeah, I like Valentino, I like Andrea Dovizioso, but Nicky Hayden, oh my God, he's so cool. He's such a cool guy. That to me is like a massive, it's almost like a stretch of reality,
I was going to say, like, across the industry, everyone I talked to, I've never heard anyone have anything bad to say about Nicky, ever. Not in any circumstance or situation. And I think that really goes to show, like, what kind of person he was. And even just researching, before getting on this podcast today, like, I actually got a little tear in my eye when I was on his wiki page, and it's the photo of him and his dad, who just recently passed away, like, taking that victory lap. After I think it was the Laguna Seca race, and just think of it, like, they're total strangers to me, right? But like, I got super emotional because, we know their history, how hard that family has worked, what racing's meant to them, and how they've inspired me as a motorcycling and in racing. So yeah, I think that helps us come full circle on that question. Like, influence is not just tied to titles; it's tied to who you are as a person and a rider.
So I have one final follow-up question for both of you, but we need to take a quick break for Motul.
Sure.
I'm going to ask you the final question, and then we're going to move on to our next topic. But before we do that, let's get in a word from our sponsor, Motul. All right, so we're going to move on to the folks that really made the most influence in the industry of motorcycling in general. But before we do that, just to round this out, I kind of told my embarrassing story about like trying to, attack Peter Egan in a men's room, but like for me, it's about the experience. It is about having a conversation with somebody. I'm not a memorabilia person. I don't litter my house with memorabilia. But my question for the two of you is, as we wrap this up, with major influential people in your life, are either of you memorabilia people or no?
You go first, Jen.
Yeah, I'll confess to that. And so is my husband. So we've got a ton of stuff, and he worked extensively in the industry for some time, and we've got a ton of signatures. A lot of them on hard cards. We've got like a limited edition signed by Casey Stoner and Troy Bayliss and a bunch of other big names, like one of those hard packs they made from when Laguna Seca came back. Yeah, so we've got a shelf of honorable mentions and autographs. So. Full disclosure, yeah, definitely into the autograph scene.
Yeah, I'm less so. I think I don't know. I certainly have. I'm a bit of a pack rat. Like I'm a memorabilia keeper. I guess I do have a pair of Oakley sunglasses. Speaking of Nikki Hayden, that were.
He left them behind that day he came to the office and he called looking for them. You're like, I don't know
No.
what happened to those, Nikki.
No, yeah. No, I haven't seen them,
Happened
man.
this day.
No, they're not. They weren't his. They were like the Nikki Hayden signature Oakleys or whatever that I think we were like sent to us at the office or something like that. And honestly, they're not my favorite sunglasses, to be perfectly frank. But they have like there's like a little 69 logo on there. And I keep them in my toolbox in the garage, and I use them when I pedal my bicycle or something like that. And I occasionally look at them and I'm like, I don't really. But then I see the 69 on the side and I'm like, I can't throw these away. I can't do it. So I still have those Nikki Hayden Oakleys that I like, even though I don't like them. You know what I mean? So yeah. And I guess while we're confessing to embarrassing things, I will say the Ben Bostrom. I mentioned Ben Bostrom because I feel like he to me was sort of like he was. I don't know if you guys have feelings about this, but I feel like he was sort of like cool in a way that few other racers accessed. Even
Ben
Nikki,
Bostrom
to
is
me,
a name that I don't know. So for the
Oh,
audience,
really?
sake, can we just give a 2-minute?
Jen's appalled.
Well, let's point the anger at me. I'll take
No.
it. But let's also recognize it.
B-Boz and E-Boz, the Boz Bros.
So Ben Bostrom and Eric Bostrom are two brothers that came up through the Harley Davidson Sportster, like 883 racing series, right? Jen, is it Sportster 1200 or something like that? There was a Harley Davidson racing series before they did the XR 1200 series, I think. That was sort of like it was in the Formula Extreme AMA era, and they did well in that, and then one of them got a Formula Extreme ride, and anyway, they both ended up racing Superbike and Ben ended up racing World Superbike. Eric also to a lesser extent. But they were these like rad guys that were like very kind of like they had shaggy hair and big sideburns, and like Ben Bostrom was someone that I like interacted with as a 12-year-old or something like that, like trying to get his autograph and being like, oh, can I have your autograph? And he was like, sure, no problem. Like, what's your name, man? And I was like, it's Zach. And he was like, oh, that's a cool name. And I was like, what? So
Did he spell it wrong?
Probably. He ended up racing World Superbike and like winning World Superbike rounds. And I mean, he was teammates with Ruben Schaus or with Troy Bayliss, maybe, I forget, or Troy Corser, whatever, one of the Troys. And he, I don't know, like I just from a kind of Steve McQueen like epitome of cool sense, no one could touch him in my mind. Like I bought his replica helmet. Like I grew out sideburns as soon as I could. It was I was in hook, line, and sinker. Do you have anything else to add about Ben Bostrom, Jen?
I'm just picturing like a young 13-year-old, like, entering puberty, Zach trying to grow your sideburns out. And,
No, I was like
him.
I was like 19 before I could grow sideburns. Definitely a late bloomer. And they were wispy, pathetic sideburns. But I was like, hey, I want to be like Ben.
Yeah, I mean, Zach pretty much got all there. I just know that the Boz Bros were very influential on the road racing scene in America. So if you ever did a track day, you were an amateur racer, like everyone heard of them. And I think Ben was definitely the bad boy, and Eric is much sweeter. And I've had the pleasure of doing some flat track training at E-Boz's camp.
Right.
So nice. So he's like the really nice brother, and I think Ben was like the intimidator out of that brother outfit. So, but yeah, they were a big name in road racing for a while.
Right. Anyway, I just you chased Peter Egan into a men's room. I just wanted to say that I grew out pathetic wispy sideburns so that I could be like Ben.
That
Bostrom.
is fair. I appreciate you sharing that, so I feel less alone. So let's go on to the next topic, which is most influential to the industry as a whole. I think we've talked a lot about the people that have influenced us in general.
Yes.
What about the people that have influenced the industry at large? And Jen, why don't we kick things off with you and some of the thoughts that you have here?
Yeah. So when I kind of picked some of these folks, I kind of did it in more of a B2B sense, like being an industry professional, working in the industry as much as I have. I've thought of people who maybe aren't as well known to the broader riding population, but maybe they are. Actually, one of them for sure is, and I'll start with him. It's Troy Lee of Troy Lee Designs. I find him very influential because not only did he start this huge business that's very successful, but the Troy Lee designs like transcends moto. They're a huge name in mountain bike now, very huge name. And also because of his paint shop, he's been on like F1 helmets. He's sponsored so many drivers and riders and mountain bike riders, like everything under the sun. Football, they did Notre Dame football helmets. So like his art and creativity and love for moto just transcends what I've seen from
That's
anyone else. Yeah, and I've had the pleasure of working under Troy Lee, and I know Troy well. I say real well. Troy has a lot of friends. Let's put it that way. But I have so much respect for what he's built, and he continues to have like a really strong dedication to motorcycling and just the sport of motorsports. And he runs the race team with the Red Bull KTM GoPro team. I'm sorry, they're a gas now. So
totally different, Jen.
Yeah, different company entirely. It's not like a gas. It's just a rebadged other Austrian motorcycle. No, it was when I started riding off road. I gravitated towards like the wildest graphics for jerseys as possible, and I still do. I still do, yeah. That has not changed. But I had a whole slew of Troy Lee Designs graphics, and probably one of the most famous ones. With the Common Tread audience is I had the one with, it was like a black jersey, but with just like fluorescent green polka dots all over it. And I think I wore it for like a Scrambler 1200 launch. And to this day, there's one of our Common Tread readers. And every time that I post a picture where I'm not wearing that jersey, he'll like copy it and like superimpose and Photoshop like the polka dot jersey on me and then post it in the comment section. So yeah, Troy Lee has had an influence on my outerwear 100%.
Who else, Jen? And who else is on your list? Let's hear it.
Yeah, and so I have Wayne Rainey on my list, and so I mean, he if you follow road racing, you know what a big name he was during kind of those like the golden age of American road racers and MotoGP. He's one of the stars of that for sure.
Early '90s. Do you know who he is?
Yes,
Spurgeon. Okay, good. Just checking.
Okay, but like I want to give him a shout out because he's always been so supportive to other racers, and obviously he's an important figure in the Moto America road racing series here. He wants to keep building the sport, so he's one of those racers that I feel like has really given back, even though we all know he's gone through that traumatic injury, but he's still so passionate about the sport, and I want to give him a shout out as being someone who's a very positive influence on the industry.
Absolutely, yeah. He could certainly just kind of rest on his laurels and be a Yamaha ambassador for the rest of his life and just kind of show up at events and shake hands and kiss babies and stuff. But he's really put a lot of effort and he's put his name behind, racing series and trying to get people involved in the right way.
And when we were
to punctuate that, I just want to say making the case for road racing in America is a really tough one. There's a lot of people who said thanks, but no thanks. But Wayne stepped up because it meant so much to him. It means so much to the industry, and he wants to see it succeed, and he's given it his best. So, yeah, it's a very tough road to walk. But sorry, go ahead, Spurgeon.
No, I was just saying when we were on break, the two of you were kind of going back and forth about a lot of racers that really kind of influenced the way other racers acted, and I just kind of wanted to make sure we brought that back up because Jen, you were just spouting things off so quickly. But what were some of the racers that you feel had a big influence on other racers?
Yeah, so yeah, we start talking about besides titles and besides influence, like racers who literally changed the way that you race or you ride the motorcycle, and how influential that is, and how they're going to become legend and live on forever just because they invented new technique of riding the motorcycle. And so yeah, let's go through the list. I had for knee dragging, right? King Kenny Roberts is largely given that credit. I know that there's some if you read the Common Tread article, there's some questions about that, but I feel like he's the first definitely to drag knee, like physically be dragging the knee. And then I feel like he also started to learn how to use the knee as a feeler, right? Like adjusting your lean angle, knowing like the end of the traction point of your motorcycle. He started to make it a true technique, not just like it happened once kind of thing. Yeah. And then we talked a lot about James Stewart from Motocross Supercross. It's called the Bubba Scrub. It's when they're hitting the jump and he kind of puts an angle and a lean on it, and you try and make the jump as flat as possible. You don't just sail it in the air with like that kind of big arch. You make it as tight as possible, and it saves a ton of time and speed when you're in a race. And he did that, and I don't think there's a single Supercross racer out there today that doesn't use the Bubba Scrub.
And like you said before, you were like, does he have as many titles as Jeremy McGrath? No. But does everybody do the Bubba Scrub on certain jumps on the track? Yes.
And for those of you that are listening, that because again, we're talking about some pretty specific topics here. When we're talking about dragging knee, we're talking about if you're on a racetrack, you kind of you hang your body off the motorcycle in a way. You use your knee as a feeler, and you're actually sliding your knee across the ground. And then with the Bubba Scrub, I would definitely highly recommend just going to YouTube and typing that in to get a visual representation of what Jen is referring to here, because it's a very specific type of skill, and it is something that has transcended motocross in general. And then
we mentioned the Rossi leg dangle. It's kind of the same thing. In MotoGP, you'll see MotoGP riders come in and like dangle a leg off the inside of the bike. They have it off the foot peg, and it sort of looks like they're out of control, but they're not. And
so Rossi started randomly doing it one weekend. I distinctly remember all the commentators be like, this seems like a Rossi game, like head game. I think he's trying to mess with his competitors. But now, like we talked about, like almost all the racers at that premier class are doing it in some form at certain tracks. Zach, my question to you, who would you credit for the like kind of first like elbow drag, like, or who perfected that technique? Like if we've got to bestow the custodian of who brought that to racing, who are you going to pick?
Good question. I don't know. I the first time I remember hearing about it or sort of seeing it in any wide capacity was 250 GP. So it was like the MotoGP intermediate class, which is now Moto 2, which uses Triumph 765 engines. Back in the day, 20 years ago, it was 250cc V-twin two-strokes. And they're an interesting blend of capability and lightness. They're small bikes, but they're pretty fast, and they have enough horsepower that they use a pretty wide rear tire, which allows more lean angle. And I feel like I remember seeing people do it there. The thing about the elbow drag, I think, is that it's not a thing, like MotoGP racers don't make a big deal about it really, as far as like using it. It's just a thing that happens for them, and like for people on, canyon roads, the squids on canyon roads, it's like, if they can get their elbow down, then it's like super, super cool. But the people that, I don't know, I feel like dragging your elbow it's kind of like, if you're talking about it, then you're probably not that good at it, because the people who actually do it all the time are just doing it by accident. And I guess to circle back to your question, I might credit Marc Marquez with.
See, that's what I was going to say. Like, you're talking about the historical aspect, but very distinctly, the person that I remember making it known was Marquez.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that Marc Marquez is certainly not the first person to drag an elbow, but he did reshape what people thought was possible as far as crashing and then saving the crash, and I think he's the person that comes to mind when I think about a MotoGP racer going through a turn and like basically, the front wheel slides out because he's turning too hard, and he's just like, nope, I'm going to fix this. And he just like pushes on the ground with his knee and his elbow and picks the bike back up in a way that that didn't often happen before he arrived.
I mean, he also had a huge influence on the gear, right? Because I remember when I started at RevZilla in 2013, like, you didn't buy an off-the-rack jacket and have it have elbow sliders on it. Like, that wasn't a thing, right? Even tracksuits didn't have elbow sliders that were replaceable. Yeah. And I feel like with Marquez coming to power, if you will, I think he really did have an influence. And now all of a sudden, you can go buy a regular leather motorcycle jacket and it's got elbow sliders on it, and the average rider is not going out on their country road and sliding their elbows unless something has gone horribly, horribly wrong. So
true. Yeah. So what about you, Jen? Who would you? I think that's a good point, Spurge. And Jen, do you have someone in mind that you think like the elbow drag, like?
Yeah, no. I mean, I was digging into the history, and I read about the 250 riders you mentioned too, and. But still in my mind, it's Marc Marquez that made it wide known and influenced gear and does it at such a consistent basis. And like you said, maybe it's a little bit of a byproduct of just going fast, and it doesn't lead to going fast, but he's definitely found ways to use that elbow as a feeler and to save some crashes potentially. So maybe it's just on the cusp of becoming something more influential in riding. But I was daring myself. I was like, what's the next big innovation in riding technique? I'm like, I guess elbow slides. Ooh.
Yeah. I mean, if you could make it work for you, then holy smokes, more power to you. Yeah. Well, I'm gonna just kind of like pivot a little bit, because one of the people that I wrote down for influences in the industry, but it was also an influence on me, I think, was Malcolm Smith. And that's in large part, I think, because of On Any Sunday, the movie On Any Sunday, which we've talked about ad nauseum, it feels like, on Highside, Lowside. At this point, it's a cinematic milestone and a classic, and especially in the motorcycle world. But for me personally, it felt like one of the upshots in On Any Sunday was that Malcolm Smith was so good at riding lots of different kinds of bikes. He was just like very talented at doing lots of different things, not, he's specifically good at this one thing, which I always thought was kind of an influence on me personally, thinking like, if you apply yourself, where it would be cool to be good at lots of different things, not just one thing, which I don't know if I've accomplished that, but I also feel like Malcolm Smith has had a huge impact on the industry. Like he was a famous rider, but then, now his name is attached to huge dealerships and lines of apparel. You probably know more about it than I do, Jen, to be honest.
Malcolm Smith Racing.
Yeah, I mean, the gear was instrumental, and he was like, he was the development and testing on it, so how cool is that? Like your pro racer is also making the best gear through his own racing.
Right.
And yeah, the dealership is, it's huge here. I've had the pleasure of just going there a lot and spending lots of money, but also knowing them well as a district sales manager. His son Alexander Smith kind of runs the helm of that now. But and Malcolm will show up occasionally when they have events and stuff, and it's always such a pleasure to go see him and shake his hand. It's kind of an honor, actually, considering everything that he's given to motorcycling. So he's definitely one of those figures that's still involved and leaving a lasting impression.
I feel bad because I brought a pile of books, but I didn't bring my Malcolm Smith book. But there was a biography written not too long ago, a couple years ago, just called Malcolm, and it was absolutely utterly fantastic read. And it gets into like the Malcolm started by assembling Honda Cubs, right? Because nobody wanted to touch these Hondas as they were being imported from Japan. And Malcolm got a job where he basically started an assembly line at the local dealership where he got paid to just assemble Cubs and put them out, because the real mechanics didn't want to touch them. And you look at his whole history, and it almost parallels all these major events in the world of motorcycling. The one thing that I want to touch on here is On Any Sunday was on my list as a huge influential point to the industry. Malcolm Smith wasn't my pick for that movie, but Bruce Brown was, because really what On Any Sunday did was it took motorcycling to the public. And when you look at really what was happening with motorcycling from the 50s and into the 60s, it was getting this bad boy image, right? It was all the rebels without a cause. And it was all of this, like, you had to be dangerous and bad to ride a motorcycle. And so when I look at, and I think about the influence in the industry, I look at On Any Sunday because it humanized motorcycling. And I also look at Mr. Honda, like literally Honda motorcycles and the idea of making it about nice people riding motorcycles. And, you meet the nicest people on a Honda. I look at, that was a huge influence on changing the way that people thought about motorcycling from the 60s and the 70s to present day. So I agree with you on any Sunday, but so not so much from the racing aspect of it, but from like the influence on the public and painting motorcycling in a different light.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, I think that whole On Any Sunday crew. Now, when I think about it, Mert Lawwill was a big star of On Any Sunday, and he, like, one of the things that the whole Grand National Series at that point was, flat track and road racing, and you had to do both, which is pretty flipping cool.
I think Mert again, he was the character in the movie that really humanized it, right? Because if I'm remembering correctly,
that shot of him like touching his baby's hand before he leaves, so that it's really powerful.
Like it was him with like his wife and kid, and he's leaving like he's just going to do a regular job, except for his job is racing motorcycles. And he hops in his van and he drives away. And I think that movie in general, and I really do credit Bruce Brown, and Bruce Brown had a whole slew of influential films, but it really did help to paint motorcycling as like this is something that anybody out there can do. You know, it opens up with the scene of kids riding bicycles, right? And I think it was really relatable for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think massively influential on almost everyone that works in the industry too. Like when I look at mentors and people high up in the chain at other companies I worked at, like all of them would credit On Any Sunday for inspiring them to ride and be in the industry and all that. So beyond just a wider cultural experience for maybe some non-riders or people new to riding, I would have to say just all the industry vets I know would be like, yep, that's the film.
Yeah.
That's the
Right.
film that
Right.
that made motorcycling a lifelong love affair for a lot of us who work in the industry.
I've got another name to throw out. I'm
Go
just
for it.
curious if you guys have if it resonates with you. Excuse me. The name is Ernst Degner. Does that mean anything to you guys?
Ernst
man.
Degner.
I'm afraid I don't know that
I'm thinking of
individual.
who's the Ernst that was.
You're thinking of Ernst and Young.
No, I'm thinking of the Ernst that was the one that wasn't it an Ernst that smuggled the Soviet technology to Japan for the two-stroke engine?
You're almost there. Yeah, that's him. Ernst
Is that
Degner.
him? I
That's
didn't
Ernst
know
Degner.
his last name was. Yeah.
So Ernst Degner was a Grand Prix motorcycle racer. I don't know that much about it. I'm not going to pretend to do a whole podcast on Ernst
I have
Degner.
that book too. I don't know where that book is. I have the book
Stealing
on him.
Speed.
Stealing Speed. Yeah.
Right, the Matt Oxley. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
So Ernst Degner, basically, way back when, those of you who know a thing or two about motorcycling, hopefully, will know that when you see two strokes, they have big expansion chambers, right? The exhaust pipes on two strokes are really big. They have this big bubble in the exhaust, and that's to help the engine work properly at certain RPMs. That's why two strokes are often associated with having really severe kind of power bands. Anyway, way back when, there was a time, two strokes have existed for a long time, but there was a time when we humans didn't understand how exhaust gases reacted and how it affected the two-stroke combustion cycle. And the East Germans, I believe MZ maybe, they figured this out, and their bikes were working better than other people's bikes, and they would like shroud the whole exhaust so that other companies couldn't see what their trick was. And to pull this into sort of a whole geopolitical thing, Ernst Degner was an East German riding for MZ, and he defected to the West, and he took the technology essentially to Suzuki, and with it, Suzuki went on to win world championships and have some amount of success due to him. And I just think what an amazing kind of tale of international espionage and geopolitical shifting that is. And it was really all centered around this motorcycle technology. And I just feel like what a massive influence that was.
And this is, I mean, we're very much paraphrasing. If this sounds anything interesting to you, I would highly recommend Stealing Speed.
Yes.
It's a fantastic book, but like the East Germans at the time, they didn't have any money. So they were taking these defunct V2 World War II rockets that were powered by these two-stroke engines and trying to figure out how to convert them into motorcycling engine, and they were winning, and they were beating all these giant corporations that had all this money. It's a tremendous story, and I think, Zach, you hit on a key point there that it has an influence to this day. Every time you walk into your local, KTM dealership or wherever, and you see an expansion chamber on a two-stroke motorcycle, like it all goes back to this one individual who took that technology, smuggled it on a train out, and I mean, he kind of got his in the end. There's a whole cloud around how the Soviet Union handled that situation, but yeah,
right,
yeah,
no. No rain, no rainbows.
It's a but it's a really fantastic story. Hollywood should make a movie out about that one. That was, it's just cool stuff.
Agreed.
But yeah,
agreed. Well, we should probably move toward the end of this podcast because I think it's
I have
been
a transition.
between 3.5 and 4 hours.
I have a transition.
Take it away.
My transition is going from most influential into our final topic, which was probably a negative influence on the industry. And Jen brought up earlier. Long way round. So for those of you that didn't know exactly what we were talking about, Ewan McGregor and Charlie Borman were. Ewan McGregor obviously was much more well known as a famous actor. He had a buddy, Charlie, and the two of them decided they're going to take these motorcycles around the world. And they created a TV series in 2004 called Long Way Round. And it really brought adventure motorcycling to the forefront in a lot of ways. And it was a huge positive influence on sales for BMW. KTM decided to back out of the project, and that was probably a pretty big loss that they're probably kicking themselves to on this day. But like it painted motorcycling in a very positive light. And I think it was very influential at a time when the majority of motorcycle content on television was something like American Chopper. So as we transition, this is where the transition comes into play.
Nice.
Jen and
Subtle.
Zach. When we transition into our final topic of the biggest negative influences in the world of motorcycling, the top one on my list was American Chopper. And this whole chopper craze of television build-off series in the mid, early to late 2000s, basically the entire 2000s. But like Paul and Paul Jr. Tuttle, like they just painted motorcyclists as like moronic and fighting and just macho and ego and bull. And when I look at that whole series, it doesn't showcase what I love about motorcycling. And I think for a lot of people, it was a negative influence on the sport that we cherish so much. So that's what I think made Long Way Round so important, because it was a real human look at how motorcycles actually were used in a way that wasn't so angry and fighting, which really was a lot of the programming around that American Chopper kind of vibe that we saw in the 2000s.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
Your thoughts, Jen?
I mean, that's the pitfalls of, and I'm going to say American reality TV, because I love like the British Baking Show and other shows. And like,
British Baking Show is great.
Those producers don't feel the need to like create animosity with their candidates and stuff. And it's such a more wholesome and in my opinion, like much better entertaining show to watch. And, I don't know the Orange County guys, personally or anything like that, but I guarantee you behind that there are some producers who are like, yeah, get angry, yeah, do that. It's like
absolutely
any other show. Like I like watching Ink Master too, just for the art, but man, the drama just kills it for me. So I feel like it's not just like those individuals or motorcycling that created that show to be that way. It's just the cultural phenomena around American reality TV always having to be very antagonistic. It's like, oh, it's such a bummer. But yeah.
I would agree with that. That's I've met Paul Jr. and talked to him a little bit, and he seems like a nice enough guy. I'm not defending the show because I didn't particularly like the show, and I totally get where you're coming from, Spurge. But I also know that there's a huge push in that kind of thing to like throw wrenches. Like we want you to throw wrenches, like get mad, that's an important part of it. And maybe they're to blame to a certain extent for playing along, because I have friends who are good motorcycle mechanics and were around those things, and they've told me stories about being offered a reality show and just sort of like, yeah, well, you're going to need to like, throw that lawn chair across the room. And they're just like, no, I'm not doing that, and then the producer's like, okay, well then there's nothing here, and they're not reality stars because they wouldn't jump through those hoops. So I don't know, I don't know I'm not sure where to point the finger, but I think it's a fair hand to raise the fair point to bring up, both of you, that it's just like was a really unfortunate portrayal of motorcycling and motorcyclists that might not even, that just didn't seem particularly accurate or fair, really.
Yeah, and I think we know Pat Garvin's take on a lot of what was produced on that show as well. So from the custom builder standpoint, it sounds like there's a lot of disappointments as well with what that show did to the movement. So, I mean, good call out, Spurge.
I think when you think about the fact that like if you turn on television any day of the week, pretty much any program you're going to see has cars in it, right? Like if it could be a cop show and they're riding around in a car, or it could be, the mom taking kids or dad taking kids to softball practice. Like cars are so prevalent in society. So the problem is like if you have a show like Gas Monkey Garage and people are getting angry and they're, oh man, the deadline we didn't meet, it doesn't matter because like people are so familiar with cars. But like this was like the only programming that had regular motorcycles in it, and it was just such an angry piece of content. And I think it really painted motorcyclists as a certain way.
Well, I've got a question. I want to give Jen guest honors for the last topic, so I want to throw one out there that this is not a negative influence on motorcycling, but it's one that I have always found kind of flat and uninteresting. You talk about authors. How do you feel about Robert Pirsig and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Spurgeon?
What a horrible book.
I thought for sure you were going to love it because you're all about motorcycle literature, and that one is just like one that people cite all the time.
They cite it all the time, but I think people cite it because they didn't actually read it. It's a book about philosophy. It's a philosophy book, right? Like,
yeah, which fair enough.
No, it's not like it's not a book that I would recommend to anyone that want to get jazzed about motorcycles. It's not
That's
like
true.
it's
Right.
not what people think when they hear it, and it's used in movies and all this other stuff is like this turning point. There was another book that was like this. It was called, oh my God, I'm going to blank on it. It was like, it was another, I'll have to find the title. I'll put it up on the screen. I'm blanking on it. I have it because
Books to avoid.
Well, I have it because there was a buddy that when I was teaching high school out in LA, he bought it for me. It was like motorcycle work is soulcraft, motorcycle mechanics is soulcraft or something like that. And he's like, I read about this. It's supposed to be really good. This guy was working in this big, high think tank job in D.C. and he quit and he basically opened up this motorcycle shop and he wrote this book and you'll love it. And the whole thing is just about like his deep thoughts about life and it has nothing to do with motorcycle mechanics. And it's like I feel the same way about Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It's like it's not the book that I would ever recommend to anyone that if someone comes to you and they're like, I really am interested in motorcycling, like help inspire me. I would give them Shop Class as Soulcraft. Matthew Crawford thank you, producer
Calling
Chase.
out the author too.
Yeah, Matthew Crawford.
If you're listening, Spurgeon thought your book
it was an interesting story, but it's all about his philosophy on like modern work. It has nothing to do with actually learning how to work on motorcycles. So again, I would recommend for anyone anyone that comes to you and they're like, "Hey, help inspire me," and this is going to be a segue into the comments later.
Right.
But like that's not a book that I would recommend to inspire anyone to go out and get on a motorcycle. And there's probably a lot of people out there that would disagree with me, but I'm gonna hold true on that one. I'm gonna stand behind it.
All right, Jen, you're up. Do you have any shade you want to throw?
I mean, to be fair, I started that book and couldn't finish it either. So to Spurge's point,
the Shop Class of Soulcraft or
Zen and the Art of Motorcycle.
Yeah.
You know, everyone's like, oh, what do I get Jen for Christmas? Oh, she likes motorcycles. Yeah, this
exactly.
book. And
she has 7 copies of it on her shelf.
I think I've gotten it at least 3 times, and each of them have gotten donated to really nice libraries or something. Because like I don't know, it didn't capture me. So
sure, yep.
So you're not alone, Spurge. I would continue on with that. Like for me, what I think is like the worst influence or negative influences that we need to fight in motorcycling is again like how we're portrayed in a lot of Hollywood and TV shows. Like to this day, I feel like we have a villain, let's put him on a motorcycle. It feels like it's like one of the first places people go. And actually, I want to open this up to the comments and our listeners. Like, go ahead and flood the comments with all the positive influences you've seen. Like, I'm happy to read those because I think maybe it's just in my mind. I always just get like super sad and it just drown out by like everything I see that's like a bad portrayal. You know, like I feel like Sons of Anarchy is kind of a bad portrayal. You know, like they're always outlaws.
Gun runners.
They're like they're doing bad illegal stuff and murdering people. I'm like, that's not great. And even a really benign show, it's a what's it called? Away with Hilary Swank and all this, and it's about space and all this crazy stuff. But anyway, her daughter is going through like a rebellious part of her teenage years, and she meets a boyfriend that goes motocrossing, and she decides she's gonna ride a dirt bike behind her parents' back, and she breaks her leg, and it's this huge drama, and the family's so disappointed in her, and 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 this is the worst part. She's like, she learns the error of her ways, and she'll never do that again. You know, I hate that. I hate that when they turn it around and like. See, motorcycling was bad for you. Like that's what the audience takes away.
Learn your lesson and never throw a leg over a 2-wheeled vehicle again, Hilary Swank.
You know, I really got hung up on that stuff. Nobody else has heard the show. It's really stupid. It's got terrible reviews and Rotten Tomatoes, whatever. But like, I watched that and I was like, man, I'm so bummed.
No,
and,
I agree with you.
Can't it be like we tried oil painting and like I got oil in my eye and I'll never do that again?
It could be anything else. Anything else.
No, exactly. I think it's interesting because when we were first thinking about this, and I was thinking about negative influences, really a lot of it is the way that Hollywood has painted motorcycles to just kind of bias the public against it. And the other example that I had here, kind of carrying on your theme, Jen, was the wild one with Marlon Brando, 1953. And it's like it took motorcycling at a point where it was becoming more popular with the post-World War II era and returning veterans, and it just painted the only image of motorcycling to this day. And I know that there's a lot of motorcyclists that look back on it romantic as like, oh, the rebel, and this was, so inspiring. But if you're the regular American public watching this film in 1953, motorcyclists are a bunch of angry drunks that are riding around crashing their bikes and destroying a small town community. Like, I don't understand how we're going to put that film up on a pedestal and be like, thanks, Marlon, you really did good for motorcycling here.
It was based on a real event, I think, which is to say that there are bad things associated with motorcycles.
Sure.
It's not like everyone's an angel, but yeah, to your point, glorifying the things about it that are bad, and like you said, Jen, sort of being like, well, I hope you learned your lesson. That's such a bummer of a thing to portray.
What about you, Mr. Quartz? Anything on your side that was a negative that you wanted to leave us with here?
No, well, I mean, just the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I just wanted to put that in front of everyone. But I didn't really like it. I think we should say that as a book of philosophy, lots of people have loved it, and it's been well received in many circles. So I'm not going to say that you, listener, wouldn't enjoy it. I just think it's less likely to appeal to motorcyclists, despite the title, which is an important distinction.
Yes. And for those of you, if you remember back to the Highside, Lowside Live episode, we talked a little bit about the fact that we do make book recommendations sometimes here on Highside, Lowside. So, like, not that we're starting a book club, but just
we're
saying
not anti-book here. We're not burning books over here, kids.
I would just say that as long as we're talking about books, there's a lot of great ones that we can recommend. Paul Newman's Winning has nothing to do with motorcycles, just a great book. But I would say that, as far as all the books that we've recommended, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is not one that would come to the top of my list as a recommendation.
Right. So that, I think that's a great place to leave it, don't you guys think?
Well, that's going to be the great
recommendation
segue
for a book not to read.
Yeah.
Your moment of Zen.
Yeah, exactly. In a moment of Zen, just stare at your motorcycle's oil filter for a little while and center your chi.
But let's thank Jen for being here. Jen, Indeed. This was always a pleasure when you get to join us. We are going to transition into the Highside, Lowside comments, which we'll get back into the book theme here shortly. But Jen, just wanted to say thank you again for taking the time out of your busy schedule to sit and talk about motorcycle influences with us.
It's a pleasure, guys. Thanks as always.
All right. See you soon.
Always a pleasure to have Jen Dunstan on the podcast. We are now going to transition into the Highside, Lowside comments. This is where Zach and I scour the internet. We look at YouTube comments. We read all the emails that you send in to highside, lowside at RevZilla.com. And we pick some of the comments that we want to highlight and talk about on the program. Zach, what is the first email that we got in today?
Just to be clear, producer Chase actually scours everything because he's
dedicated.
Indeed.
And we're not.
Yes. First up in Highside, Lowside comments is from someone who identified themselves as Persia from Iran, who says, and I quote, "Hello, I'm a fellow biker from Tehran, Iran. I enjoy listening to your podcast very much." Quick pause to say that's pretty freaking cool. Agreed, Spurge?
Anytime we have people that write in internationally, it always just really surprises me that we have such a large audience, and it's absolutely flattering to put it mildly. So.
Indeed. This person goes on to say, recently I've noticed more women in Tehran riding motorcycles in the city. It may not seem like a big deal, but given the fact that it's actually illegal for women to ride motorcycles here, it actually is a very big deal. I am personally very impressed by them. I thought I'd share with you guys, maybe give a shout out to the women bikers of Iran. Well, consider this a tip of the cap. That's we don't know all the details of this, but obviously people are women in Tehran sounds like are riding motorcycles, even though it's frowned upon to some degree. And we would like to give them a shout out because we think that's pretty cool, whether they're doing it because they need to get somewhere or because they love it. Either way, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and especially in considering that, it sounds like this is a situation that could get them in quite a bit of trouble. The fact that they're still choosing to ride motorcycles, I cannot compliment them enough. So first and foremost, thank you for leaving the comment for us. Thank you for being a listener. on an international scale. And again, thank you for making us aware of the fact that there's a situation right now that is helping to empower women via motorcycling. I think that's awesome.
Yes, indeed. All right, question number 2. That's you, Spurge.
Yeah, this is Manny. Split the question into 2 parts. First question says, recently became an RPM member. And this is a members program that we have on RevZilla and JPC and Cycle Gear. You get a bunch of extra benefits, but he goes on to say, Spurge mentioned in a previous episode that there's a magazine that comes with the membership. How do you claim the magazine? Sounds like Manny signed up for RPM at his local Cycle Gear location. If that makes a difference, it should make a difference. The magazine should show up in the mail. You can always head down to your local Cycle Gear store if you signed up there to become an RPM member and say, hey, I want to make sure that you have my correct email address and address to get the magazine. But Zach and I, along with Ari Henning and Jen Dunstan and Andy Greaser and Mark Cook and a slew of other
All
authors,
the movers and shakers over here.
we basically put out a print magazine of Common Tread, and you get it for free if you're an RPM member. So many can always reach out to customer service too via online, and they can make sure that one gets shipped out to you. So just note that you do have a free magazine entitled to you. Now, the final question that Manny threw in here was, Manny goes on to say, what would be a good book/magazine for someone who wants to learn more about motorcycle history and also get into MotoGP? He knows almost nothing about either. So the book recommendations, and this kind of ties into the whole theme here. First and foremost, I would recommend Leanings from Peter Egan. This is just a great book about a whole slew of different things in motorcycling. He's an amazing author, and it's a great read. But from a historical standpoint, one of my favorites is Triumph in America. This is a book that it's relatively hard to find now. I got this as a gift from Lemmy. He actually got me an autographed copy from the author there. But this is a book that it's a little bit harder to find, but I thought this was a really great read from a historical standpoint about the importation of motorcycles and really how the shift, especially in the first half of the book, about getting motorcycles into America and really what that looked like through the British motorcycle industry's eyes. It's a great historical look. There's some racing stuff in there. It has some historical racing aspect, which is something Manny was asking about as well. But just a really cool look at a time period in America where everything wasn't done by computers and the internet, right? Like if you wanted to order a motorcycle that was a British Triumph, you were writing a letter to a manufacturer across an ocean, and then a couple months later, if you were lucky and your check cleared, a motorcycle would show up. And so it's really interesting. And that was a book recommendation that I just wanted to throw out for Manny. But Zach, what do you got? What do you got for a book recommendation?
My book recommendation for Manny is a book that I have not read, so I can't really put the full weight of my
Endorsement
behind it. But it is called Never Say Never. It is written by Nick Harris, who
Can
was
you hold that over in front of your face just for a second?
Can you not see it?
There we go.
Can you see it now?
Never Say Never, my inside story of the Motorcycle World Championships. Okay.
Right. Nick Harris was an announcer for MotoGP for many, 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 many years. And if you watched MotoGP anytime in the last, 5 or even 10 years, you probably recognize his voice. But he wrote a book about, sort of about the history of World Championship racing and his sort of inside story. I mean, he traveled around he was in the paddock for decades and decades. And he's a good storyteller. He's really enthusiastic. And I mean, he witnessed a lot of really, memorable races, over the years, and, has lots of stories to tell about, the riders themselves and the sort of some of the behind the scenes of the World Championship. So I think that's a good one. It combines learning about bikes and learning about MotoGP, and and I think it's a fairly light read. I don't think it'd be too dense. If you're interested in motorcycles, I think you get a kick out of it. So check it out.
There you go, Manny. Not only did Manny get some recommendations for a book, but I haven't read that book yet either. So depending on how it turns out, Zach, you'll have to let me know, and that's one that I'll add to my book club recommendation list as well.
Righto. All right. Well, I think it's high time that we let the fine viewers and listeners of Highside, Lowside get on with the rest of their day. A friendly reminder to leave a comment. As Jen said, if you have motorcycle influences, if you think we missed major facets of that, please leave a comment below or send us an email to highsidelowside@RevZilla.com. And a friendly reminder to Eric Danger 13, who has a slightly better relationship with his father due to Highside Lowside, allegedly. Please do send us an email to highsidelowside@RevZilla.com to claim your t-shirt. And everyone else, be inspired by Eric Danger to leave a review for us.
Yeah, we would love it if you went over to the Apple Podcast page right now and left us a review, and we'll pick another winner for the next episode. But for right now, I think it's time for us to bid you all adieu, and we're going to go ride some motorcycles ourselves, and hopefully this podcast has inspired you and influenced you to do the same.
Thanks for hanging out, everybody. See you next time.